it gets overwhelming. So, if I know I'm not going to use something, and I tend to only look we might as well just throw this in there. The question is this the Mike Heiser version of Logos that has all the books? And no, I don't know how many are in here, but I really make an effort to only look at peer-reviewed material. So I've actually done a few things to tweak my software to eliminate like popular titles and stuff like that. It's not perfect, but I do that as well to sort of winnow search results. I mean, I'm still going to get thousands of hits depending on what I search for, but I've made my own collections. If you have the software, I'll just give you for instance, if I right-click on Mari here, oh, come on. Oh, let's see here. Oh, let's do it this way. You can see it better. Okay, if I open up a search and I want to search for Mari, and I'm in basic search, I can search for, since my own book is open somewhere here in the desktop, I could search for that, but what I've done is I've made my own collections, like all my Greek reference grammars, all the way down the line, so that I can run a search against all of them at once, or I can try to narrow it in a specific corpus or a specific kind of book. Like my commentaries, again, what I've loaded into the commentary collection is, all the major, scholarly sets. So it's just a way for me to try to winnow search results, because it gets overwhelming pretty quickly. And I'm not a search wizard. I'm too lazy, I guess, to use all the little Boolean operators and the brackets, and it's just I'd mess it up somewhere. Yeah, you're laughing. I'd mess it up somewhere. Okay, who has a question? Go ahead.
Was Gilgamesh the same as Nimrod or Osiris?
The question is, thank you. I'm supposed to repeat the questions. The question is, was Gilgamesh the same as Nimrod and Osiris? No. They all sort of get lumped into discussions about, wrongly, they get lumped into discussions like for dying and rising gods in the ancient Near East. And there's nothing like that said about Nimrod. Okay. Gilgamesh gets thrown into that with Osiris because Gilgamesh was searching for everlasting life. Well, that's a lot different than this dying and rising thing. But unfortunately, a lot of these major ancient literary characters and characters from the Bible get sort of dumped into the same drawer. So you got to be careful. A lot of the analogies people think they are striking. Okay, they might find a point of similarity between these figures, but what they're not telling you is the other 10 points where they disagree. So that's something you got to be mindful of. Go ahead.
So Psalm 19 you referenced. The first half of it seems to be about stuff about the heavens.
Yep.
And the second half seems to be a lot about the Torah.
Yep.
I was wondering, is there some connection between the heavens and the Torah that they're making, or that's there that we in our current worldview wouldn't see? Question.
Sure. Yeah. The question is there a relationship between the two halves of Psalm 19? Because the first half, looks at the heavens as a source point for wisdom, and the second half is really about the Torah, about the law. Again, this answer isn't unique to me, but I think, I think that they are both viewed as sources of revelation, sources of wisdom. And if I could use this analogy, when you're talking about the heavens, you're talking about general revelation. When you're talking about the Torah, you're talking about special revelation. Okay, if you've had any sort of biblical training, the terms general revelation and special revelation should mean something to you. General revelation is what scholars talk about, of what we can learn about God and His ways and His nature through creation. Okay, special revelation gets that label because God is specifically telling us things about Himself that we couldn't learn from the first group. And so he moves people to write things down, through inspiration. That special revelation usually gets labeled, well, that's what we call the Bible. It's special, it's particular. So I think Psalm 19, again, that paradigm is a useful one for looking at the Psalm and saying, okay, we can learn some things about what God is, who God is and what he's up to in the heavens, but we also need the Torah. And for a Jew, they wouldn't look at them as competing systems. They would look at them as cooperative, consistent sources of revelation. They just serve different purposes. One is more limited than the other. One is more particular than the other. So, anybody else? Yeah.
So the book of Enoch was in Genesis time frame, but we think it was written in the Second Temple period by somebody. So, I mean, was it just bits and pieces that were handed down and they?
This is a really good question because I know.
I'm trying to say it loud too.
Thank you. The book of Enoch, it appears to have been written in the Second Temple period, but it's set in the pre-flood, flood period. So, how do we talk about its date? I guess is a good way to summarize that. When you talk about a book, you have to clarify whether you're talking about manuscript data or whether you're talking about the ideas in a particular book. In terms of manuscript data, the oldest stuff we have for Enoch comes from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So people, scholars who, are really focused on this area are pretty comfortable dating Enoch roughly 2nd century BC, so 200 and more recent, 200 to 1, down to year 0 if you want to use that terminology. And that's because there were Aramaic fragments of Enoch found at Qumran. So there is no textual evidence older than that for the book. There's a lot of Greek evidence that comes from the same period. Most of the book is preserved in Greek. The Aramaic is fragmentary. The only place the entire book is preserved is in Ethiopic, which is quite late. For us, if you're talking manuscripts, you're talking the late Middle Ages for the whole book, getting up into the early modern period. But everybody, again, because you have the Qumran stuff, everybody figures, well, the book at one time it existed at least, in the 2nd century BC and, ostensibly in Aramaic. Now, if you're talking about the content of the book, which we spent a lot of time here, really specific points of content in Enoch are much, much older than that. So there's a literary history, a manuscript history, and there's a conceptual, thematic content history. So, usually when people ask the question, they're talking about manuscripts, the actual document itself. So what we have for that, that's pretty old. It's over 2,000 years, but it's not going back into the Noahic period, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Well, kind of on that, when I was studying the book of Enoch, I heard this talk about the tradition of the book of Noah, going back like Enoch would draw from a text. Is there anything to that? Or?
There are books of Noah. Is there anything? The question is there anything to the tradition about a book of Noah? There are books of Noah. They've been published. Again, they're considered part of the Second Temple corpus. Why? Why is everything lined up there? It's because of Qumran. It's because of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's our oldest repository for stuff. So if you find a portion of a book in there, that's where the wall, that's where you hit the wall. So Noah material again is it's going to have its own. You can buy all the books of Noah stuff, in an anthology and an edition. Some will group it in Enochian, the larger category of Enochian material for obvious reasons. It's the flood and the watchers and stuff like that. But you don't really gain any chronological ground, with that. And it gets its name because it's about Noah. It's about the flood. And again, it doesn't mean that somebody dug this up on Ararat and then just kept it. No, it refers to the content. in the back row. Go
The
ahead.
Rephaim being post-flood, was there a second wave of watchers falling after?
Yeah, we're never. Thank you. See, I'm really terrible at this. I'm terrible at repeating questions. Rephaim after the flood. Let's just broaden it. Giants after the flood. Was there a second wave of this? In terms of the biblical text, we're never told anything like that. As far as another period or event of cohabitation. That's one of the three options for why they're there. And in Unseen Realm, I sketch out the three explanations for how you get giant clans after the flood. And in short terms, one is you view either Noah or Noah's sons or the daughters married to those sons as somehow being a carrier, for lack of a better word. And for some ancient Jews, that was their answer, because you will find texts that say that. You'll find there's one text that describes Noah as a giant. Again, it tells you that when you find a text like that, it tells you they're thinking about the question, and so they feel like they've got to come up with some answer to it. So Noah was like fathered by one of them, those who shall not be named. That. You'll find another text where Noah's parents are having an argument. His dad Lamech. This is the Genesis Apocryphon. It's a very famous text. Lamech goes to his wife, who's actually given a name in the text, Bitanosh or Batanosh. Both of them mean daughter of man. But he comes to her and says, well, I heard about all this Watcher stuff going on. And I just want to make sure that this kid's mine. And they have an argument. She's like, don't you remember the other night when, So again, it tells you that they're thinking about the question. So that's one option. Another option is you view the flood not as a truly global event, but a regional event, regional or localized event. And, you can have that view and still say to the biblical writer, this was all the earth because all the nations of the earth are listed in Genesis 10. To us, that's regional, but to them, it was comprehensive, whatever. But you have to somehow then have ancestors, Nephilim ancestors, survive the flood in some region of the known world. And people who take that view will usually go to the Aegean Sea, because of the Philistines. The Philistines are actually members, we know this from Egyptian texts. The Philistines are a group of people from a larger group of people called the Sea Peoples, who were seafaring peoples from the Aegean. They come to the mainland, of not only Egypt but Canaan on boats. That's how they get there. If you've read The Portent, I go into some of this stuff, to strike a fictional trajectory about Goliath. But since Goliath was the son of Rapha, which you can say, well, that means he's a Rephaim, and he's a Philistine, and they're one of the sea peoples, that maybe something survived here. Jeremiah talks about the Philistines coming from Kaftor, which is one of the Aegean, islands and stuff like that. And again, people know where the Philistines came from. The third option is to take Genesis 6:1, Genesis 6:4, and translate it a little bit differently. And this is legitimate. This is possible. If you go to Genesis 6:4, I'll try not to have a grammar spasm here. But it says, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward when the sons of God came into the daughters of men and they bore children to them. Now, when there, you can take that particle, and because of the verb form that follows it, being an imperfect verb form, you can translate it this way. The Nephilim were on earth in those days and also afterward, whenever the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, they bore children to them. You'll actually see this verse referenced in Hebrew reference grammars. about this particular use of the imperfect with this particle. So that's possible. Now, should we do that? Is that what it really means to say? Well, who knows, because it's a translation choice. And that's all you got. You just sort of pick one of those three, answers to the question, why we get them on the other side of the flood. And that's, targeting these Rephaim. Because you get Rephaim in Deuteronomy 2 and 3. It's very clear. They're described as being very tall. They're referred to as Anakim. The Anakim, according to Numbers 13, come, quote, from the Nephilim. I mean, it's point blank, what's there. So those are the paths you have to follow, to answer that question. Go ahead.
If it is the third option, do you think that would have been a second incursion by different watchers, or would that have been the first group that somehow escaped out of the abyss?
Yeah, I don't think there's any indication that the original offenders get anywhere except where they're always described as being in prison. So you would have to have the same sort of transgression of heaven and earth is what it comes down to. And there's no indication of that specifically. I mean, you could look at what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11 about because of the angels, and you could say, well, Paul apparently thought this was a possibility. Okay, you could say that, but Paul's not making a statement that it did. It's just he's like, we just don't ever want to see this happen again. It's that kind of thing. So you could take that and say, well, for Paul maybe it was a possibility, but it's not a real answer to the question. Go ahead.
When it comes to authorship of Genesis 1 through 11, I understand, given the polemic content of Mesopotamia, most people believe it was written in the captivity. Given how, though, during the Exodus and during the conquest narrative, the children of Israel were encountering the Amorites and whatnot, we know from the description of Oxbed and everything, they had this Babylonian content coming in. Is there any possibility that, what do you think about the idea that there was enough cross-cultural content there, contamination, if we will, that could Moses have written Genesis 1 through 11 based on that and still be a valid work?
Yeah, the question is really, when do I think Genesis 1 to 11 was written? Because of the heavy Mesopotamian influence there in those 11 chapters. And could Moses have had that information? That's a short way of saying it. Well, I would never want to say that Moses couldn't have had the information. Moses is an Egyptian. He's raised in the court of Pharaoh, Akkadian during the New Kingdom, which would be the Mosaic era by either chronology, either later or older chronology. Akkadian in that period, which was the literary language of Babylonian stuff, Mesopotamian stuff, was kind of like English is today. It was the lingua franca. It was the language of international correspondence. And we know that for sure because of the Tel El Amarna letters. Okay, these are letters, it's a correspondence. I'm sure you've heard of the El Amarna letters. They're actually a correspondence between the Pharaoh of Egypt and his underlings in Canaan, the people he's put in charge. And they're written in Akkadian. They're not written in Egyptian. So we know that for sure. So if Moses, again, was being groomed to be a pharaoh or a diplomat or some other high office in the household of Pharaoh, I think it's reasonable to assume he probably had to learn Akkadian. I think that's a reasonable assumption. Again, it's still an argument from silence because we don't actually know what he read. The question then becomes, okay, if he could read it, what is he reading? There's no evidence in Egypt that you have libraries from Mesopotamia in Egypt. You have lots of correspondence. You got lots of letters and documents and land deeds. And wouldn't that have been awful, to spend your youth, deciphering economic texts, like somebody's bill to somebody for 10 sheep, treaties, I guess, would be better. You got to learn that stuff. But so we don't really know, again, what he would have been reading. On the other side, there's so much that is overtly polemic in Genesis 1 to 11 against Mesopotamian material that it's really next to impossible. And in fact, it would just violate what you actually see in the text to say that whoever wrote Genesis 1 through 11, or at least this part of Genesis 1 through 11, was not looking at a Mesopotamian text specifically to respond to things in that text. Because it's more than like deity names and stuff like that. It's even grammar in some places, where they want the literate person to know what they are tracking on and what they're objecting to, how they are subverting the Mesopotamian material that they assume the reader knows. It gets very detailed. So there are places you just have to have that in front of you, unless I guess you memorized cuneiform or something. I mean, again, that's possible. There were people who did that. So it's a back and forth, for me. I think the more reasonable explanation is that Genesis 1 through 11 was either composed or edited during the exile with this strategy in mind. But I won't say that it's impossible that Moses, could have known that and had access to the material. We don't see a path, but that doesn't mean there wasn't one. So, go ahead.
First, a confession: I have not read the
Gasp!
So you might have covered this, the answer to this question in there, but I'm curious about your view on the historical basis of Genesis 6 and connected to the Watchers. So it seems like what you're presenting is that the Watchers extrapolation in Enoch is giving us more information about what's happening in the author's intent in Genesis 6. And so we have there the sons of God and the daughters of men, and it's always been, in a question about what is meant by the sons of God. And so you've presented a possible solution here, which seems to me, and this is where I want the clarification, it seems to me that you're saying that the sons of God mean some angelic beings that become corporeal somehow on the earth. And so my question, first of all, is that what you're presenting? And secondly, metaphysically, what does that mean, since angelic beings are spirit beings? What does it mean for a spirit being to have a body and physically copulate and produce human offspring? How does that work?
Yeah, I think they probably picked that up because my butt's right here. Okay.
So I was speaking loudly.
Yeah. I'll take the second part first. The idea that spirit beings can take on flesh and do things that flesh does is a very biblical idea. God himself, even before the incarnation, takes on bodily form. Genesis 18 is the classic example where God, Yahweh, shows up with two men who we find out in Genesis 19 are actually angels. They're called angels in Genesis 19. So the three of them come and visit Abraham. They look like men. They're embodied. They sit down. They have a meal. They eat together. I mean, it says all these things. The two angels, of course, grab Lot and pull him into the house. And you have instances where divine beings become corporeal, and they are truly corporeal. Again, it's not incarnation. I want to be careful there. Theologians would use words like embodiment for that. But the assumption is that, okay, they don't have to eat, but they can. Spirit beings don't have to do anything that a body does. But when they inhabit a body, it's a body. It does what bodies do. The whole trajectory seems to indicate, and this is pretty consistent when you get angel talk in Scripture. And in the book, I spend 3 chapters talking about the 2 Yahweh figures in the Old Testament. The visible Yahweh appears to Israelites as a man, and that doesn't mean the invisible Yahweh is there and not anywhere else. There's still God, both in heaven and on earth. On earth, he's this human being. God as man is not a New Testament invention. It comes from the Old Testament. And it's part of what becomes Trinitarian thinking. And I'm a standard Trinitarian. But you get the impression that when a divine being comes to earth, especially if it's not God or not the Father, that the required form of dress is flesh. There are very few. In fact, it would be hard for me to come up with one where an angel speaks to anybody in the Bible and they're not in human form. I mean, I know God does that. I can't, off the top of my head, I can't really think of an angel ever doing that. You have to be able, the person has to be able to process who's in their presence and what they're talking with. So God even does that at some times. So in terms of the precedent for it, it's there. Now you say, well, why include, the notion of copulation in the book? This is why I wanted to make clear to people that there are two views of Genesis 6 that are supernatural in orientation. One is sexual cohabitation. The other one takes the language in Genesis 6 as euphemistic for other gods, other sons of God, other divine beings, as intentionally raising up human populations who in the biblical story ultimately turn out to be the peoples that are trying to exterminate the Israelites when they get into the land. You say, well, how would that work? It's the Abraham and Sarah analogy. It's very clear that God did something to enable Abraham and Sarah to have children. There is no hint of any sexual contact between God and Sarah. But the text is equally clear that they were supernaturally enabled to have children when they were well beyond the age of doing so. So the assumption in view number 2 is that divine beings can do something, with people to enable them to have children. And so maybe that's what Genesis 6 is talking about, minus the sexual language. And I go back to the first part of the question. I take the supernatural view because I don't want to disagree with Peter and Jude, because they're inspired and I'm not. Peter and Jude very plainly, explicitly, I frankly, I know and I'll be as bold to say, I know the sophistry involved to try to get them to say something they're not saying. I know how that's done because I'm a scholar and scholars do that sort of thing. They refer to the angels that sinned, in 2 Peter and Jude. These angels are in prison until the time of the end. There is no angelic sin, not only in the Old Testament, but in the entirety of the Bible. There is no plural angelic sin anywhere except for Genesis 6. So you either have to say Peter and Jude are making one up, or they're thinking about Genesis 6. It's the only place you can go. And since they throw in the detail about the imprisonment, which you won't find in the Old Testament directly, you'll get it obliquely in underworld passages that have, guess who, the Rephaim in them. You'll get it there obliquely. But the only place that does say that directly is the Enochian material, which again is tracking on both the Mesopotamian story and Genesis 6. And ultimately the Mesopotamian story is what Genesis 6 is written to respond to. So essentially you're trapped. If you want to get your theology from the text, you either have to affirm the supernatural nature of Genesis 6, 1 through 4, or you say Peter and Jude got it wrong. That's your choice. Now people don't, I know. That's his whole point.
Yeah.
So, people don't like to hear this. It was one of the things, again, when we were talking about publishing Unseen Realm, it's like, this is going to cause a controversy because, frankly, people don't want to hear that. Christians don't want to hear that. Christians, this is why I say we and it's not anything bad about people. Again, it's just that we're taught to be selectively supernatural. Okay, well, we accept God, we accept Trinity, we accept Satan, because we got to have that, or else why even have a discussion about Christianity? But then why exclude this other stuff? Well, I'll tell you why, because it's just stinking weird. Okay, that's why we're excluding it. Peter and Jude didn't do that. Irenaeus didn't do that. Lots of other, famous figures that you could go to in church history didn't do that. I don't use guys from church history as an argument, not because I view them as foes, but they're not they're not from the actual context. You know, they're later. I mean, I think they're doing the best they can with what they have. But you know, yeah, I'm well aware that that's, you know, controversial. I don't really care what view it takes. As far as the metaphysics of it, like how does that work? I don't know, because I'm not a god. I'm not a deity. I'm me. Okay, I can't tell you. You know, I kind of use the phrase a lot. I try not to put the words God and can't into too many sentences. I also try not to sound like I know what a divine being can or cannot do. I have no idea. Okay, because biblical theology, I think, requires us to affirm the reality of a supernatural world where such beings exist. I got to go with that and then wonder about, well, what is it like to be one of them? Like what can they actually do? What are their limitations? I don't know the answers to any of those questions. Go ahead.
So follow up on Peter and Jude. The standard explanation I've heard before is that Peter and Jude were referring to First Enoch as mythology. So similar to how a modern preacher might say, well, you know how Darth Vader interacted with so-and-so. Well, that's a lesson that should show us this. Not treating the Star Wars story as historical in any way, but as a convenient contemporary example. Why do you think that's not the right way to interpret Peter and Jude when it refers to these things?
Because they were predisposed to believing in a supernatural world. It's everywhere in all their texts. We like that explanation because it lets us not believe certain things while we affirm other things. If you're an ancient person, you don't have that tension at all. There's no tension to dismiss a supernatural claim because of something else. They were consistently, you know, looking at, you know, the supernatural world. And what people who make the claim don't realize is that there are lots of not only would that put Peter and Jude out of step with everybody else in their contemporary world, it would also make them inconsistent in their use of the material. Because Peter and Jude are going to quote other parts of Enoch that nobody bickers about.
That's right.
So it's an inconsistent hermeneutic from the get-go, but most people don't realize that because they haven't read the Enochian material and they don't see where else it shows up. Again, the value of scholars, you know, whether they believe anything about the supernatural or not, is the fact that there's been a pile of scholarship showing, and again, in the book here, I'm trying to distill, you know, parts of it. There's a pile of scholarship that shows how influential is not the right word, but how transparent a lot of Enochian stuff is throughout the New Testament. A lot of it is not very spectacular or interesting. You know, just parables and analogies to this or that. It's nothing that would really invite much discussion. But like in the appendix to the book, there are dozens of places, dozens and dozens, where Enoch and other pseudepigraphical material is cited or alluded to by New Testament writers. And just going with that analogy like preachers do, that's very normal. You have it in your head, it's going to connect with your audience because your audience knows what you're talking about, and you use that, you know, to illustrate some point or articulate some point. That's what they're doing with all of this stuff. And to pick 2 or 3 passages out in Peter and Jude and say, oh, well, they didn't really mean it here. They weren't being serious about it here, not knowing that there's all this other stuff over here that nobody ever talks about, is really inconsistent. So that's how I would approach that. There was another hand over. Go ahead.
The word blameless in his generations, is that his bloodline, or what is that?
Let's just go to the question is about the line blameless in his generations. If I can find my mouse here. Okay, the word here is dor in Hebrew. Got to switch my search here. We're not going to find Hebrew in the New Testament.
Good.
There we go. There's like one exception here. I think I can remember it down here in the Book of Numbers somewhere. Door is the term you would use. Let's just go down here. Just park there for a while. Door is the term you would use of generation in terms of like your timeline or your epoch. Like if we talk about the generation of the 60s, okay, that's not referring to lineal genealogical descent. It's referring to sort of a time period. Dor is the typical word for that, not lineal descent. Lineal descent is typically toledot. These are the generations of, and then you get the grocery list. Okay. There are exceptions though. There are one or two places where Dor, right here, Numbers 18:23. But the Levites shall do the service of the tent of meeting, and they shall bear their iniquity. It shall be a perpetuate statute throughout your generations. Now, if he's speaking to the Levites there, he's referring to the Levites and their descendants. This is their job. Okay, that sort of thing. So there it could refer to lineal descent. Down here, until all the generation. That could either be time period or again, people's bloodlines. I mean, there are one or two that could sort of go either way. Generations, plural, again, referring to the people themselves, not just a specific time period. There are a handful of references where Dor could refer to lineal descent. And so going back to Genesis 6:9, if I were the writer of this text and I wanted you, the reader, to think of lineal descent, I would not use Dor because you might be misled. I would use Toledot. But if I did use Dor, and that's what we have here, there's still a possibility I could have been thinking that. So you can't eliminate it. You can just make it a question of probability. It most likely does not refer to that. Question, yes.
This is a kind of a couple questions bundled into one. In your second science fiction book, you talked about the gematria of the number 153 as being the sons of God.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could give a little discussion.
There's a spoiler. Go ahead. The cat's out of the bag now. I should have stopped you right there.
I was wondering if you could give a discussion or give an overview of what you currently think Jesus was talking about, or the writer was talking about with the 153 fish that were caught. And also, can you put a number into Logos Bible software and get something like that?
Yeah. You're going to, the second question first. The question is, discuss a little bit the number 153 at the end of the book of John and the meaning of that. And then, can you search Logos essentially for numbers? You're dependent on, your initial search would be dependent on whether the book or the translation uses the numbers in the translation or whether it writes them out. Once you had a hit, then you could look at the word number underneath the actual text and construct a search that way. So you'd have to do a couple things to make sure that you got everything.
Well, what I mean is, could I put the number 153 in some tool, and could it generate every Hebrew word that gematria
No,
adds up?
we don't have a gematria creator in the software. Gematria one way or the other. I would be astonished though. In fact, I'm pretty sure that there are such things on the web. I don't know how good they are.
That's why.
Yeah, I'm sure that I've seen one, but I just don't know if it works two directions or one. And it's actually tricky because if let's just take 666. The number is not only famous for being 666, but some texts of the book, we'll get back to the 153. I'm not trying to deflect attention. the number 666 is famous, for obvious reasons, but there are some manuscripts of the Greek New Testament that do not read 666 as the number of the beast. They read 616. Now that's important because it's sort of what makes a lot of scholars think that Nero is the figure John is thinking about, or the archetype, a new archetype for the Antichrist. I actually don't buy that. I think the best archetype is still Antiochus IV because of Daniel 11. But anyway, the reason why Nero is important is because depending on how you spell his name, whether you use Aramaic or Latin, and then his name actually had variant spellings, that is the only name in antiquity that can account for both numbers by gematria. But you have to sort of cheat by the way you spell it, to make it work. So if you're creating a gematria tool, you also have to account. You'd have to at least tell people, make sure your spelling is correct and what language you're using and all that, because it's gonna affect the results ultimately. Now the 153, the view I have in the portent is the view I take. By gematria, 153 reverts back out into Hebrew as the sons of God. So if you're in that passage in John, where they're out there fishing and they drag up the 153 fish, and again the context is, being fishers of men and all that stuff. To have a reference back to the sons of God, I think is significant because the disciples are told to go out and win people to the Lord, to make disciples of all nations. What they're doing is they're gathering God's children, the sons of God, the children of God. So a gematria reference for 153, I think, makes really good sense there. There are other gematria references and people argue about that one. There's a couple other things you could do with it. But given the context, which is typically how I judge gematria, again, if I were the writer, is this consistent with the context of what I'm writing? And in that instance, it is. So I think we should assign a reasonable level of probability that this is what John's trying to do. John also wrote the book of Revelation, 666. I mean, he's familiar with gematria. Okay, he knows what this is. Now, there are some esotericists that take the number of 153 and they go back to Pythagoras with it, and it has to do with esoteric, symbolism and whatnot. Even if you take that view just as a rabbit trail here and say, oh, this is Pythagorean, predates the New Testament and some guy stole it from Pythagoras. Look, what would the point be then? Jesus is greater than Pythagoras. Well, duh. Okay, I mean, no kidding. But Pythagoras was a major figure. You have the the Platonists and the whole Platonic school of thought. And Jesus would be being cast as a greater teacher than this esoteric tradition. You can go that way. But I think, again, for a Jewish audience, it makes more sense to tap back into Old Testament theology, this whole idea of believers, people who are members of God's family being referred to that way. So that makes more sense to me. The dove passage, I didn't put this into Unseen Realm, but I don't think I did. Can't remember half the time what's in there. But the passage at Jesus' baptism where the Spirit of God descends upon Jesus as a dove. I believe it or not, scholars are sort of mystified by that because there's no reference to, people think, okay, well that, like a dove, that goes back to Genesis 1:3 where the Spirit, the Ruach, the Spirit of God is hovering over the waters. And the verb there is a participle that's used elsewhere of an eagle in Deuteronomy 32. And again, all that's true, but it's not the word for dove. So people are looking at that like, well, it's probably not a reference back to Genesis 1, or they would have used some word that is found in that passage. And I think that's correct. But if you take the word dove and you do gematria on it, it has the same equivalent as the Greek letters alpha and omega together. I don't think that's a coincidence. Because John, okay, we're still in the Gospel of John here. I mean, is the same guy who does the Alpha and Omega thing. Again, I just think he's just he's putting breadcrumbs in there. For the people who know what he's doing, he's laying the breadcrumbs out. So even at the baptism, I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. So, to me that makes sense. At least I consider it a strong possibility, that's what we could be looking at in certain passages. I don't think it's widespread in Scripture. I would never recommend we use gematria as a hermeneutic, but there are places where people have considered that, and it packs a punch, when it does.
I've heard this before, and I was curious if you know if it was true or not. Was there, at the time of that passage being written, like 153 or 154 known nations?
Yeah, I've never come across that. Yeah. If you come across that, I'd like to see it, though. Greg.
My question. All right, we have the Genesis 6, then you have the flood that wipes everything out.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have the conquest narratives where what we learned from your book is, Joshua was told to wipe out certain people groups because of the Nephilim. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So those are these sons of God, daughters of men incidences. But there's another passage where he wipes everybody out except for a couple survivors, and that's Sodom and Gomorrah.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no connection, biblically speaking, I think. Is there intertestamental literature that has some kind of a Genesis 6 flavor to that Sodom and Gomorrah event? And the second question, what's with this whole pillar of salt thing?
Yeah. The questions about about the Sodom and Gomorrah incident, is there some connection between that and the Genesis 6 and then the pillar of salt thing? I have not come across a specific connection to that other than the reference to angels there. So again, as of right now, I don't see one. I just haven't come across one. I can't say I've looked at it as much as I've looked at other things, but I would think that if there's something there, I probably would have come across it. But who knows? Pillar of salt thing. I mean, I tend to read that pretty straightforwardly. I don't think there's anything terribly cryptic in it. I do think that it's do we have to view Lot's wife as turning into a pillar of salt, or is this sort of a play on words, to make us think of the Dead Sea later on? Is that really what you're getting at? There will be some who argue the latter, that the language there is sort of deliberate to make us think of the specific geographical region. Well, the problem with that is scholars don't really know conclusively where Sodom and Gomorrah were. One possible location is the Dead Sea, which is associated with the salt and all that. So there might be something to that, but I tend to just read it as for what it says. This is the way God decided to punish her, so that she would become an emblem of disobedience. And I don't know, there might be something more to it. I just haven't come across it yet.
Well, doesn't Luke 17 kind of link the days of Noah and the Sodom and Gomorrah story?
Go ahead.
Well, it says, just as it was in the days of Noah, so will be the days of the Son of Man, marrying and stuff. And then right after that, Jesus says, the Lot and the Sodom and Gomorrah. So
that's my wife, by the way. We'll talk about that later. No, I think the connection there is the angels, and the reason angels had a significant role to play in eschatology generally. And so I think that's why those instances are grouped together, because they both concern angelic presence, in judgment, specifically in judgment. I talk a little bit about this in the the last section of the book, because there are passages in the Old Testament that very specifically link it in conjunction with the day of the Lord. Again, it's an important biblical concept. The day of the Lord is, again, the time of the end where all the enemies of God get punished and all the righteous, they turn out to be rewarded in either in this life or the next, and so on and so forth. Everything wrong is made right. Everything right, stands, for what it is. So we tend to think of that in terms of the way we're taught about Armageddon, this big battle, on the earth. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. But there are passages like Isaiah 34, Isaiah 24, that refer to this final conflict as involving angels, divine beings, the stars of heaven, the holy ones, come with the Lord, down to earth to punish not only the host on earth, but the host of heaven in heaven. And it's a reference to the fact that when God cleans house, this isn't the only house that gets cleaned. In other words, the earthly sphere is going to be judged, but also the spiritual world is going to get the same treatment. And so for that reason, you have angels often referenced with this time of the end kind of stuff because they have a specific role to play. And it's judgment. Genesis 6, Sodom and Gomorrah, that sort of thing. But anything more specific, going back to the first 4 verses of Genesis 6, I haven't come across anything there yet. Yes, sir.
So, expanding on what you just mentioned, divine intervention, what are your thoughts about that with regards to the timeline that you've expressed in both your writings as well as some of your studies as well?
What do you mean by timeline?
Nothing by accident, coincidence, happenstance.
Mm-hmm.
Everything for a purpose of reason and function. How does that carry through into your writings?
Are you talking about the theme of providence, just generally? Yeah. The question is how does sort of the providence, I guess, in general, and maybe in the flow of events, factor into what I write about? It's a big deal in the fiction because one of the things I want to communicate in the fiction is I think a better sense, a greater sense of providence, just generally. We have this impression that God only shows up in the spectacular. Oh, we prayed for this person and they got healed. God showed up. Whereas, we prayed for this person and they didn't get healed. Where was God? Again, we talk this way as though God is only around and only doing something when there's something spectacular going on. I think that is a deeply flawed view of God. God is typically in the non-spectacular. I think we don't put enough evidence on the unseen hand. That's typically the way God works. Because again, this is why, and I've brought it up in interviews before, I like movies like It's a Wonderful Life or Mr. Destiny or these things where something in the story changes about a character's life and then you get to see what his life would have been had that moment been different. Yeah, it's the same kind of thing. I like those because I think they teach some good theology. That in this respect, that we often don't think about our lives as being where you are today is a result of many thousands of decisions that you've made and decisions that other people have made, not only that but people you don't know. Because every decision ripples through a countless number of lives and you're caught up in this torrent. Okay, and it matters. And if you've read Unseen Realm, I talk a lot about the concept of imaging and free will and how what you do matters. And this is the way God has built the universe. God hasn't built the universe where he either has to or needs to go in there and just destroy everything to make it work. Okay, that is counter to the biblical model. So again, if we thought of ourselves this way, we might have a more renewed sense of purpose. That what I actually do today is actually going to matter. It might matter in the next 5 minutes after I do it. It might matter 5 years from now. But that isn't my job to know how it matters. My job is just to understand that it does matter and that God will use it because God doesn't we're not robots. He didn't make us this way. We can't image God if everything is predestined. Okay, you cannot be an imager of God if you do not have free will. Okay, this is communicable attributes theology 101. Okay, you can't do that because you cease to be in God's image at that point. It's why God doesn't deal with evil by eliminating. Why doesn't God just eliminate evil? Well, to do that, he'd have to eliminate not only all of us, but everything else in the spiritual world, because everything is derivative. Everything, this is why we get the plurals in Genesis 1. Spiritual beings are created as images of God. He shares his attributes with them. They represent him in their world as we do in our world. We share the communicable attributes of God. Why is there evil? It's because God decided to do that. God decided to not make us robots. He knows what the cost is going to be because he's omniscient. Okay? He knows what the cost is going to be. But he would rather have that cost happen than not have us at all. Those are the choices. So, everything is not nailed down. 1 Samuel 23 is the example I like because it's the most clear. I just don't know how you can miss it. Where God foreknows two things that never happen. That tells you immediately that foreknowledge does not necessitate predestination because they didn't happen. If it did necessitate predestination, they would have had to have happened. Again, it's not complicated stuff. It's just, again, we're not really asked to think about a lot of it. So, back to your question, it's like, that's how I think, at least how I try to think, of life. What you do is going to ripple out. And God will use other people, he'll use divine beings, he'll use his spirit, and he may actually get into the act himself on occasion. Again, the minimal occasions of the spectacular. He can do that if he wants, but he doesn't need to. And he will influence everything, people, to the end to which he desires. People rebel all the time. The agents he uses can rebel. They do frequently. Okay, God's solution isn't, I'm so frustrated now, I'm just going to destroy everyone. Okay, that isn't the solution. God will work the plan. And things will move inexorably toward the end to which God wants them to go. So in the novels, I try to play with that. Again, I don't want to go into scenes, but there are just scenes where something that happened like 10 years ago that was like completely incomprehensible makes total sense now. And not only does it make sense, but nothing else could have happened here to make this outcome work. Just that kind of thing. I love, to put that sort of thing in fiction because I do think that's the way life actually works. But again, we tend to view God as this vending machine, or this box, that, hey, if I push the button, like the slot machine, if I push the buttons long enough, I'm going to get a jackpot. I'm going to see something work. Okay, that just isn't. It's really deeply flawed. So that's important. And academically, I can discuss passages, but I think the fiction's a little better for that.
It's a great platform.
Yeah. Well, we'll go over here. We'll move this direction. Go ahead.
What is the significance of the sin of Balaam being mentioned in both Peter and Jude when they quote Enoch?
I mean, you do.
Question.
I know. I'm sorry. What is? This is brutal, isn't it? What is the significance of the sin of Balaam when Peter and Jude mention it? I think there is a broad and perhaps a more narrow reason why it's on their minds. I mean, broadly, it's rebellion. Broadly, there is this sense of this is one of the avenues in the Old Testament. Again, the sin of Balaam is Balaam gets the Israelites to cohabit and have relationships with foreign women, the Moabites, and so on and so forth. And it was something that they were forbidden from doing. That is often connected, broadly speaking, with false teaching. because when you do that, when you marry outside the family of God, you either are exposed to, or to make your marriage work or whatever, you bring in the religion, another religion from the outside. So the two broad things are rebellion and then this connection with false teaching. It's one of the reasons why you get false teaching elsewhere talked about in terms of, for lack of a better way of putting it, like mixed marriages and things like this in both testaments. I think more particularly, though, I think there is something to taking both those ideas, the rebellion and then the bad theology, the false teaching, and that those two things are attachable to the sexual transgression of the Watchers. I think it's peripheral, but I think that they could be thinking that as well, because this one event basically did these two things over here, if you can follow the reasoning there. So I think that may be lurking in the back of their minds specifically, but if you go back to the actual passage in the Old Testament, you don't have anything specifically in that passage, the Balaam incident, that links back into Genesis 6. You could get there if you focus on the Moabites, the region, and then go to Deuteronomy 2 and 3, because the Amim were the giants in this region, again, that are also called Rephaim, that come from the Anakim, the Nephilim. I mean, you can get there, but it feels a little forced, to go that route, even though you could. So I tend to view it more, again, more of a theme, sort of a conceptual, matrix of ideas there. That Balaam, they belong in the same bucket. They just may not be, linked together specifically. Go ahead.
All right. I just want to clarify, like the Watchers and the Watchers from Genesis 6 and the sons of God, the gods of the nations. They are like different groups.
They're different groups. Yeah.
Like sons of God, right?
Yeah.
So, and then the paranormal activity, like the demonic activity that we have right now. So they're not the Watchers, because they were imprisoned like prior to the flood or during the flood.
It depends which group you're talking about.
Like,
so I'll summarize the question this way. The question was about, demonic activity that we might see now, or again referenced in the Gospels, and the sons of God and the Watchers. I mean, what's up with that? Is this one group or many? You have different groups because you have different rebellions. We have Genesis 3, you got one entity, you have a divine rebellion, the figure we know as Satan, and so on and so forth. Genesis 6, you got a bunch. We're never, Old Testament doesn't give us a number. Other texts, throw numbers around. But you have a divine rebellion there, which is punished by, we're sending you to the abyss, okay? Then you have a third rebellion, which we haven't really talked about today, but I spent a lot of time talking about in the book, and that is what happens at Babel. Where God punishes the nations, he assigns them to sons of God, other lesser Elohim, lesser divine beings than himself, as a punishment. So that's a totally different group. Now, that group is the one that is the orienting point for what scholars call cosmic geography. Different episodes in the Old Testament where things happen that the language is used that a typical deity is associated with a typical place. Paul is referencing this when he refers to principalities and powers. Paul uses terms that show up in Daniel 10, the princes, the prince of Persia, prince of Greece, all that kind of talk, divine beings that are over the nations and manipulating them and abusing them. Paul's other vocabulary, thrones, dominions, powers, rulers, authorities, they are all terms used of geographical rulership. That is not a coincidence. Paul understands the world of the Gentile perceived through the eyes of God, that these nations are under the dominion of divine beings that he assigned to those nations, but who rebelled. That's what Psalm 82 is about, and are now hostile to him. So we have spiritual warfare in the most explicit sense in all this. But they're a third group. So there's no sense that that group has been dealt with or punished or put in the abyss. So they're, for lack of a better way of putting it, they're running around. They're doing their thing. They're abusing the nations. They're abusing the people. They get the people to, do all sorts of things in self-destructive patterns. Again, it's back to Psalm 82. So they're gonna be judged again at the time of the end, which means they can still be active in some sense now. Now, I personally don't assign specific points of geography to them anymore, and that's because the Old Testament story, once you get post-cross, it's no longer about just this entity, Israel, and 70 nations in Genesis 10. It becomes about all the world. Okay, now needs to be won back. It's not, Jesus is not just the Messiah for Israel, he is the Messiah to the nations. Paul is the apostle to the nations, to the Gentiles. It becomes global on both sides. If you are Christ, you are Abraham's seed and heir according to the promise. This is written to Gentiles in Galatians 3. Okay, the people of God are not just Israelites. It has nothing to do with ethnicity. It has nothing to do with land boundaries. Okay, the people of God are those Jew or Gentile who align themselves with Christ, and where they are is where he is. Okay, where 2 or 3 of you are gathered, there I am in your midst. Just this whole theology that cosmic geography now is wherever Christians are, that should be considered holy ground and treated as such and taken as holy ground, to use the metaphor. Wherever the Spirit of God is not present, because the Spirit of God indwells believers. This is why believers are called collectively and individually the temple. Okay, again, the language is not accidental. This is where the glory is. Okay, wherever it's not, wherever believers are not, that is ground under dominion of somebody else. And so that's the sense. We need to view it in a sort of a collective sense. So in that regard, that whole system created through the events of the Old Testament is still around and still active. But those guys, again, in biblical thinking and in Second Temple Jewish thinking, those are not the demons that Jesus encounters in the Gospels. That's something else. Those are specifically, we saw one passage in Enoch. The demons in the Gospel stories are the disembodied, immaterial part of the dead Nephilim, the dead giant clans. This is why you get Rephaim in the underworld in the Old Testament, to create that linkage. Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 32, Job 26, you see them there. And that thinking went all the way in between the Testaments, where you have lots of texts talking about this is what demons are. This is why demons are called at Qumran, bastard spirits. They're bastards because they're mixed. They come from this event back here. This is why the terminology is used, and to telegraph this. But we're not taught this in church. We're not taught demonology in church, I guess for a good reason. This is standard Jewish demonology. I don't really have to look too hard to find it in the text. But all that group, and again this national stuff, this cosmic geographical stuff, those are the two groups that Jesus and the apostles have to deal with. So, you can look at what goes on in the world today, and I trust missionaries I've given divine counsel lectures to like groups of African pastors, and they can barely stay awake, because it's like, yeah, we deal with this all the time. This is like, no kidding, and they get it because they run into it. There's a very, I won't want to call it famous, but if you're interested from a sort of a more tame Christian context, we'll pick on the Lutherans here. There's a book called I Am Not Afraid. It's by a Lutheran guy, and you can't get any more unexcited than Lutherans, okay? These aren't charismatics, okay? So it was this, guy had to write a dissertation, and his dissertation topic was like church planting in Africa. So he went to some group that his church and his denomination was helping in Africa. And when he got over there, part of their liturgy, everywhere they went, and their order of service was exorcisms. They would just go into a town and, we're going to have a church service. We're going to start a church here. And They didn't have to solicit anything. People would show up, and before they did anything, it's like, okay, we need to claim this as holy ground because of the principalities and powers, and they do whatever their service, and people would go crazy. It would sort of bring out the possession. Instead of bring out your dead, it's bring out your possessed, And they just like went through this is what we do. And this guy was like shocked. He's like, they never taught us this in seminary. Did Luther write about this? And so he wound up changing his topic to write about that. Because he couldn't believe it. He'd never seen anything like it. And to the people over there, they're still Lutherans. They're still boring. Okay, they're still not charismatic. But they're like, yep, it's just what we need to do here. So we do it. Because if we didn't do it, we wouldn't get anywhere. Okay. Get her done. So I trust people who have no reason to lie to me, and they have no reason to just lie in general. Missionaries from all over the world, we went into that town, and there was just this place that we were told, this is owned, this is under dominion. And you get a confrontation there, something goes on there. I mean, there's something that is going on there. So I think that stuff does happen and can happen. It's a reflection of, again, the whole cosmic geographical thing. So it's either that or it's, again, some low-level, demonic entity. Because, again, if you know the terminology, sons of God, the geographical dominion guys are they're higher on the pecking order in both biblical and standard Jewish demonology. Go ahead.
Does that go to what you're talking about, like Vern and Audrey?
They run into it occasionally. They don't run into a whole lot of that.
I actually had a different question, if I could.
Yeah. Well, there was a question over here.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. We've been going through Corinthians, and this kind of goes back to something you just mentioned a minute ago. Paul's new creation language in 2 Corinthians 5. Generally speaking, I've always heard it taught and kind of understood it as, well, when we become believers, we need to live our lives according to the gospel. We need to live our lives like Christ would live our lives, and Christ lived his life. And you just get this kind of giant overview of this is what you're supposed to be as a new creation. You need to live your life correctly. But going through like 1 Corinthians 15, resurrection chapter, it seems Paul has like a much more focused idea, I think, behind the new creation language. And as we kind of talked about, like,
are you suggesting it has something to do with the rolling back of the nations?
Well, yeah,
and their gods.
We talked about like the three rebellions. We have
sounds suspiciously biblical.
We have the sacrifice of Christ, of course, allowing us communion with God again, kind of reversing the fall, if you will. We have the spreading of the gospel, which is reversing Deuteronomy 32. The Spirit indwelling believer and the new creation language, is that a reversal of Genesis 6?
I think it's a reversal of all of it.
All of it.
Okay. When I think about the Messiah, just in academic terms, the Messiah was about undoing all of it. The cross is about a solution for the problem of death. That was the result of what happens in Genesis 3. Estrangement from God. We are separated, estranged from the source of life. You cannot have eternal life unless you're in the presence of God. Okay, so it's about a solution for that. It's about a solution for the general proliferation of depravity in the world, which, again, Second Temple Jews are going to lay squarely at the feet of the whole Genesis 6 thing. It's also about reversing what happened at Babel, taking the nations back, making the Gentiles part of the people of God again. Again, all of it. The Messiah is critical to all of that. And we just spent a week with Fern and Audrey at the end of September. And what they wanted this year, they wanted to spend, I say a week, it's 3 days, it's always 3 days. They wanted to spend 3 days on the theme of the death of the gods, or the defeat of the gods. And so we went through a couple Old Testament passages, but I think that the best thing for them, and we started in 1 Corinthians 15, is when Paul talks about the resurrection. Oh, for sure he talks about Jesus is the first fruits of the resurrection, and you're united to Christ, you're in Christ, all these familiar Pauline terms, to identify us with the one who rose from the dead, and Paul's teaching, well, then you're going to rise from the dead too. Okay, that's the way we hear it in church. Nothing wrong with it. It's true. But what we miss is that Paul often connects resurrection language with the defeat of the principalities and the powers and the rulers and the authorities. He does it in half a dozen places. So the question is, well, it's easy to see why Paul, when he's thinking about resurrections, thinks about his own resurrection and living forever with the Lord. That's easy. Why does he keep thinking about, the principalities and the powers and the nations? Okay, that's why, because they need to be brought back into the fold. The resurrection was the key event to take the effect of what the Messiah did and apply it to the cosmic, geographical, Gentile problem. And the Gentile problem is not just that they're not Jews. The Gentile problem is that they are under dominion. And that was God's own decision all the way back into Babel. And so the messaging is really clear. Jesus is saying, I am not here. What I did, what I'm doing, what I did, it's not just about the Jew. It's not just about, fulfilling covenants given to the Jews. It is about reversing this whole set of circumstances. It's about everything. And so in Paul's mind, since this was why he was called to go to the Gentiles, this is in his head the whole time. This is the authority, because now he can go to a Gentile and he can say, look, dude, I know that Yahweh, the God of Israel, put your whole, all of you guys under dominion because of what happened at Babel. Burnett's paper goes into Plato, into Philo. The secular Greco-Roman world had the same view, that the nations had been assigned their gods. Okay, they had the same view. So the Gentiles know what he's talking about. It's just that Paul says that the one behind this is the God of Israel, and it was a punishment. It's not a good thing. You were punished by this. So you think that to be right with those gods, you have to stay put and worship them and believe them. Well, I'm here to tell you that's just garbage. I'm here to tell you that Jesus of Nazareth was this God, the Most High, in flesh, incarnate, died on the cross, rose again, and you don't have to obey these other powers. In fact, it's not a bad thing if you disobey them. It's what the real God wants you to do. He wants you to reject them. He wants you back in the fold. That's why he writes to the Galatians, having once tasted the heavenly gift, are you going back to be enslaved? It's like, this is insane. You people are insane. Again, because he's thinking of it in these terms. Why do you want to be shackled to beings that are already defeated? As the church grows, it's proof that their rule is invalidated. It becomes the legal basis for saying, you don't belong here anymore. You have no authority. And if you've listened to the Fern and Audrey podcast, that's important language to them, because of who they minister to. They'll be in sessions and get into that sort of language, and people just, especially the ones who have some occult background, they just get that instantly, and it matters to them. But that isn't the only thing they see, but they get a lot of that sort of thing going on. Go ahead.
So, of the three fallen groups, and is there? I'm a fireman, so I work in the incident command system and span of control. Are they working for one incident commander? I mean, is that Lucifer? Are they independent? Yeah. Are they just all doing their own thing?
I'm gonna again. There's no verse that actually spells this out, but okay. The question is, what's the pecking order? What's the hierarchy? Who do all the bad guys work for one bad guy? For Satan. I actually don't think that they all work for Satan. I think they all have a common enemy, and the common agenda is control. I think Satan is called what he's called, the God of this world, because he owns humanity in a theological sense, and if we're going to use legal vocabulary. Why? Because all humans die. Okay, he essentially owns their soul, and the resurrection is the solution to that. You have to have the resurrection is important. You have to have a death before it, or else you don't have a resurrection. And once you have one, you can't go back to being dead. So that is the solution for that ownership problem. And he's the one that reaps that benefit, as it were, or reaps that result of his own rebellion and human failure. So there's that, but there's no hint in any scripture, any text that I know of, that, for instance, Satan was the one who convinced the sons of God in Genesis 6 to go do that. There's nothing like that. Satan was the one who put the bug in God's ear to assign the other nations to other sons of God, knowing that they would rebel. There's nothing like that. So there's definitely pecking order language. Sons of God is a term that was used of an elite part of an administration, because you tended to give the best jobs to your relatives. They're the ones you sort of have on a tighter leash. You're related to them. In theory, you can trust them more, that sort of thing. This rulership language is borrowed from the ancient, Near Eastern world to telegraph to us that there's a hierarchical system. Angel, malach, angelos. It's just a messenger. That's what they do. They don't govern territory. They take messages. It's a job description. So there is a pecking order in terms of tasks, very task oriented, but there's nothing that says they all work for one guy. I think he gets primacy of place as well, not just because of the death, the mortality problem, and the one who ruined God's plan initially, but since he was the first rebel, he has sort of street cred among all the other rebels. And I think what he says to Jesus in the temptation was sincere. In other words, he knows who Jesus is. It's very evident. He knows why he's here in terms of what the end game is. Well, the Son of God's here. He wouldn't be here unless God had that silly kingdom of God thing on his brain again, this restoring the kingdom idea. So we know, he's the son of David. We know what God's angling for here. He wants control of the earth again. So he says to Jesus, I can give you that. I can give you the nations of the world. Okay, and I read that as saying that I believe that the devil believed he could pull that off. He can say, look, he can say to all the other guys, look, we'll surrender our sovereignty to the Son of the Most High if he bows down and worships me. Okay, so I think the offer was sincere in that respect. And Jesus is like, well, I know something you don't. I know that really doesn't solve the problem, A, because I have to die and rise again. And I'm not spilling the beans here either. And I don't need what you're offering. I have another way of getting it. So, eat dust, just get out of here. So I tend to think, again, they're free will beings as well. They have a common enemy. They want control, but that doesn't mean that they all salute one entity. I think there's competition.
We call that independent action.
Yes. Okay, go ahead, Lori.
I just want to go back to what you described before when you were talking about Paul was assigned to the Gentiles.
Mm-hmm.
As a baby Christian, when you learn about Paul, you learn about he is the Jewish academic, right? And you think, well, why isn't he assigned to the Jews? They don't understand. He's killing Jews. He can teach those Pharisees. What's going on? But that's what's amazing when you learn about all this stuff. The Genesis 6. It's like, that's why. It's because he knew his Bible.
He's the perfect choice.
Exactly.
He not only knows his Bible really well, but he knows lots of other texts really well.
Exactly.
Because he quotes more external texts more often than anyone else in the New Testament. So,
Can you explain his training, just brief little?
Well, he sat at the feet. He sat at the feet of Gamaliel. That's in his in some biographical language Paul uses. So, Gamaliel was a well-known, highly respected teacher in rabbinic Judaism. He would have been a recognized authority within the whole community, and so Paul was his student. And based upon what you read in Acts and again, some of the stuff he says in Philippians, but he was either a member, Paul was either a member of the Sanhedrin or sort of a member in waiting. Some people argue about that based upon what may have been Paul's age. Was he married or not? And, all that sort of stuff. But he certainly had high stature. He was also extremely well-read. He uses Septuagint. He uses Targum at some time. He quotes Hebrew. He quotes, Greek poets. He quotes Second Temple Jewish literature. He quotes, classical, religious texts. It's very evident that he had for his day, he had a premier education, and a member of the Pharisee party, as he says in Philippians. So, there's plenty of Pharisees to go around who knew their Old Testament really well, but there were only a handful that were steeped in Hellenistic material. So Paul becomes, in hindsight, a really good choice. We'll take one more, and then we should get going. I'm on a leash today, but go ahead. Go ahead.
You mentioned the alignment of September 11th, 3 BC, and so I've heard you sidestep this question before.
And I'll sidestep it again.
Is there another alignment in the future, near future?
Oh yes, there. I'm sorry. The question is, in regard to the September 11th, 3 BC birth, is there going to be an alignment of the same circumstances in the future? The short answer is yes. In the portent, I do not give the date for that, nor will I. There's a lot of talk on the internet about this. That when anybody know when the world is supposed to end again next? It's like no, it's in September 27. I think it's September 23rd or something like that, 2017. Oh, I get them in email, so something like that. And part of the problem is there are people who are, there's some methodological flaws to this. Number one, there isn't a single verse in the New Testament or in the Bible period that tells us we should look for the same set of astronomical circumstances that were present at the birth of the Messiah and will be present at his second coming. There is zero, not a single verse. We're also never told, B, what the sign of the Son of Man is. Okay, because there's astronomical language associated with the second coming, and the one reference point that we're given is the sign of the Son of Man. Okay, that's nice. Is that the set of birth circumstances? Is that the set of circumstances at the crucifixion? Is that the set of circumstances at the resurrection? Or does it mean something totally different? Does it just mean the Lord, when he comes back, hey, there he is, the Son of Man? Has nothing to do with astronomy. The answer is, it could be any of that or none of it. We just aren't told. We are told that no man knows the day or hour, so I would suggest that since you can track days and hours with astronomy, that's probably not the thing that we should be looking at with any certainty as far as the second coming of Christ. Now, you'll have people endlessly speculate about this on the end, and of course, I mean, who knows why? I could get real nasty and speculate why. Some people are just desperate for a following, I guess. But they'll. How many of you have read The Portent? I'm not going to give another spoiler here. Okay. I have a Mantello. Okay, Mantello is real. He's just not a mute Pakistani kid. He's somebody else. And I get emails from him regularly about, look at this, look at that. And he sends me all these charts, and it's full of astronomy talk, and most of it goes over my head, which is why I need him. But he'll say, here they go again. They're plotting this thing out, and they're assuming that the only signs that matter are the ones in Revelation 12. or they're assuming a specific set of signs that were present on September 11, 3 BC, not realizing that there are things present at that date that aren't present at this one, because the sky is the sky and always will be the sky. So how many parameters should we put in here? How many should we consider? And he'll just give me the whole grocery list of these things. Now, I know, because he doesn't use BCC, I know who else gets that information. And there are people who are getting that information that should be just shutting up, but instead will take parts that they want to take and put it on their website and put it into videos and put it into books so they can gain a following. Okay, I have not posted about that. I'm just waiting for the right time to do that. Okay. So
Right before
oh no, right after the failure. Right after the failure. Yes, I know where the information goes. But, again, I just think it's wrong, to be a date setter. And so I will not put what Mantello thinks. Mantello would say it like this. He'd say, well, if we're supposed to look at this, here's what we'd look for. Okay, and yes, there are dates like that. You can plot them out. You can do all sorts of stuff with them. So if I were of this mindset, here's what I would be putting out there. So, I'm just not going to do that. I think it's irresponsible. People will run with it. Even people know me by now, I'm not going to do that. But that's not going to stop somebody else from doing it.
Thank you.
In the back, last one.
Will this new book be an audible version and a digital version?
The Enoch book will be on Kindle. I don't know about the audio. I'd have to ask Tom if he has a plan there. I don't know that they've ever done an audio book, but he might consider it. And it's the same with the novels are not in audio. Unseen Realm is, but that was a publisher decision. I've actually never listened to it. So they hired some guy who does that. I don't even know what it sounds like.
That's British.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Is he British?
No,
Is it British?
No.
Oh darn! Right. Yeah. I'd love to sound British. Yeah. So I don't know, but I'll ask him. I'll ask him if there's any. The only one I know about is Kindle, because that's in the contract, but I don't know what else.
By the way, it's 15 hours long.
It is? Okay. 15. Yeah, it took a lot longer. 1 hour for every year it took to produce the thing. Yeah. Somebody do the gematria on that. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for coming. Thanks for your patience.